Well, we'll get started. Thank you for being here, and we'll kick things off. I'm Roger Valdez, fellow with the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and have been working on the housing topic and portfolio for FREOPP for about the last 6 years now, and write or post at Forbes frequently. You'll see some of my stuff there. And then also founded an organization called Seattle for Growth, which we've changed to the Center for Housing Economics to be able to do more work nationally. And so that's what I do, and I'll let each of these folks identify themselves when they respond, but I'm just going to kind of give a general proposition about housing and then kind of let each of these folks respond and then kind of go from there in our conversation, and then maybe take some questions towards the end. Well, if I'm known for anything, I hope it's for two slogans. First, we don't need more affordable housing. We need more housing so that it's affordable. And zoning is a 20th century solution to a 19th century problem. Axiomatic to my theory of solving housing price problems is that housing is a commodity, not an entitlement. However, in the United States, and maybe even in this conference, it's almost universally held that housing is not a commodity, or at least not like any other commodity. So we treat it differently in our language and our assumptions that form our approach to it in terms of policy, economics, and regulation. And my counterexamples are food and cell phones, and I'm just using this to be provocative. You know, food is heavily subsidized in the United States, but it is not regulated by local government or subjected to design review. That jar of peanut butter might go up and down in price, but we have a variety of brands and prices to choose from. Imagine if every jar of peanut butter faced a gauntlet of regulatory review. Imagine if your neighbor could slow down peanut butter production because she thinks that jar of peanut butter is too big and out of scale with the context on everything else on the shelf. The second example is cell phones. The devices we routinely hold in our hands have more technology than the entire Apollo program, yet almost everyone, including people struggling to pay rent every month, have a cell phone. So we have no low-income cell phone tax credit program to subsidize nonprofit cell phone and service providers to help people get affordable phones. So the motion and the idea I want to lay before you guys is that until we begin to regulate housing like any other commodity or product in the market, we will continue to see local governments choke supply with zoning and regulation, and will be forced to subsidize housing for billions of dollars to compensate for that inflationary policy. To change this, the federal government must demand local governments maximize market production until it fails, and only then subsidize that market failure with cash, direct cash payments for rent, not unlike the voucher program. And then finally, build for truly people that are truly either not earning any income or coming out of recovery or earning very little or on a fixed income. So that's kind of where I wanted to kick things off, and I'll just leave it to you guys to start. Don't make me call on you. You got the mic, John.
Yeah, since I've got the mic, why don't I say just a couple things. I think, zoning and housing supply constraints are sort of a precondition for most of the affordability issues that we've, or a very large chunk of the affordability issues that we've sort of been experiencing. So, and what I mean by precondition is that it allows for, what does it mean to have supply constrained housing market? It means that supply doesn't respond to increased demand. And so what it means is that things like interest rates, or things like other sort of just exogenous shocks, like people moving to the suburbs, and being enabled by work from home technology, that those sorts of changes, whether it's a policy shock or some sort of other shock, that those things just get the impact on the housing market and on housing prices are just all the more amplified. So how did zoning start? 1920s. There's a significant amount of change, and how how we sort of resolve housing issues in general. And that sort of led us to this system of land commissions and of zoning commissions and municipal governments having a lot of say over these sorts of disputes. Whereas sort of before it was, you'd go in front of a court essentially, if you had some sort of zoning dispute. So zoning is a 20th century or is a relatively new issue over the past 100 years. It's not something that we really had since then. And if you look at housing prices by almost any metric, if you look at the Case-Shiller indices going back to the 1800s, this kind of like real price growth, so like home prices minus general inflation, is a relatively recent phenomenon. And I think it in part, it's in many respects attributable to zoning, which has gotten substantially worse since the 1970s. And there's a whole sort of story and reasons for why it came into place in the 20s and why it expanded in the 70s. But and that's just the U.S. And if you look around the world, you'll find that there's enormous housing supply constraints in many places. In Canada, you look at Australia, New Zealand, the UK, all these places which have seen enormously skyrocketing cost of housing in recent years, it really comes back to that. Now, sort of laced on top of that, you have this massive system of subsidies, everything from in the U.S., sticking just to the U.S. here. We have things like Section 8 vouchers. We have low-income housing tax credits. We have things like mortgage interest tax deduction. We have all sorts of a whole litany of different types of, in some cities, rent control that have all largely, in my opinion, failed to sort of stem this affordability issue. And so I think really it all comes back to zoning and reforming land use regulations. And I think that's sort of the key takeaway. I'm not going to be the only person that probably says that on a number of panels, but I think just reiterating that message, I think, is just so key when we talk about affordability and getting costs under control.
Ben, you want to jump in and respond to this idea?
Sure. So I think we could talk for a long time about this. So Ben Hobbs, I currently work for Senator Tim Scott. Prior to this, I worked in the previous administration at the White House and HUD, along with Dana. So we'll talk a little bit about probably some of the things that we did in the previous administration. And I think this issue is starting to become a little bit more bipartisan. But what we'd often say is there's bipartisan support for eliminating regulations, and then there's bipartisan support for increasing regulations. And we do have to protect, I would say, local control. And we can be a little bit more agnostic on, the different regulations that different municipalities or states decide to do. Some states are very obtuse in maybe their land, or communities are obtuse in their land regulations, but then others have permitting problems or environmental regulations. And I think a key here would be taking a little bit more agnostic approach to saying, allowing communities to, choose what they want to how they want to regulate their markets, but still, pointing out, how those regulations, whether it's rent control in California or permitting in New York, causes some of these housing shortages. And I mean, the end of the day, we need more housing. I think the National Multifamily Housing Council came out and said we need 4.3 million more apartments by 2035. And, Roger, you've done studies and such, and home builders have, I think it's up to 40% of the cost of development is directly attributed to these rules and regulations at the local level. And so, when we're looking at federal dollars, oftentimes the worst offenders like San Francisco or New York get the most money. And so it's just good money going after bad. I'm going to steal your line on that one.
I don't know if I made that up.
So Dana, can you comment on that idea of conditioning subsidies on deregulating housing and land use regulation. And I have a thing in Forbes today pointing out or highlighting a recommendation from the governor of Montana's task force on housing. And what they're proposing is tying state subsidies and perhaps even tax credit allocations to real reductions and streamlining of local land use and housing codes. That was something that there was some attempt at that in the Biden administration's recent proposal about housing, but it doesn't seem to really have any teeth to it. So is there a way to accomplish this so that because of the 10th Amendment, the federal government can't sort of repeal local land use codes, but is there a way to condition the subsidies to make actual strides in improving the supply of market rate housing?
Well, that is a great question. First of all, I want to say I'm Dana Wade. I'm the Chief Production Officer at Walker & Dunlop. We are a large commercial real estate company. We provide debt and equity. We do investment sales, so buying and selling of commercial properties. I work on the debt side. I'm the Chief Production Officer for FHA Finance. I work a lot with developers, nonprofits, other entities who actually are trying to get units out into the market. And I can tell you, it's a difficult process. You know, sometimes I look at the process and I think, it's a wonder anything gets built with all of the layers of requirements, the things that you have to do on the federal level, the state level, the local level, permitting, zoning. It takes a long time, and it's certainly not a rational process. So I think there are a lot of good ideas, some of which you mentioned out there. But one thing I wanted to bring up, Ben, did you watch the election results this week? Yes. You know there was an election this week.
Yes.
And I think we were all kind of focused on what's going to happen in Congress. And, you know, we still don't have a conclusive answer there yet. But on the ballot in many local jurisdictions was something that I think is even more pernicious than, you know, anything that you've mentioned. And that is rent control. Rent control is probably the thing that from a policy perspective, that I'm most concerned about right now. And, you know, unfortunately, there were a lot of rent control measures that received approval and will be implemented in places like California, not surprising, Oregon, also Orange County, Florida. So, you know, this is an extreme answer to the problem of affordable housing. We know we have a problem with lack of affordability. You know, you brought up a stat. We know we're millions of units short in terms of providing places where everyone can live. We also know that, you know, 50% of Americans are spending over 30% of their income on rent and utilities, and that number is growing. So we know the affordability problem, and I think people want to take decisive action, but I can tell you rent control is not going to solve the problem. It is, if you look at examples, and I, you know, hate to go off into this, I want to address your question too, but, you know, if you kind of look at examples about what is have some of these policies done to the availability of housing, you're seeing a dramatic decrease in permitting. In new permits, you're seeing developers who don't want to go into those areas, right? Mm-hmm. So it has exactly the opposite effect of what it should have. And so I'm watching that, and I'm just, you know, extremely concerned, worried. I think if we're trying to inject market forces in order to provide people with a stable, affordable place to live so that they can prosper and climb the economic ladder, this is not the direction to go in.
Right. I mean, St. Paul is a perfect example of that. They passed a measure and then now are desperately trying to undo the damage because when you use price controls to regulate price, inevitably you create more inflation, and because there's a lack of incentive to produce, and so there's scarcity, which means it just makes the problem worse. So is there any will in whether it's I know at the state level there's a great piece of legislation that passed in Ohio that I call it a beautiful piece of legislation because it really lays out the rationale, and because it's a Dillon state, it sort of really makes it. They had to go through some hoops legally in the language to explain why this was an important thing to do, but they just eliminated it, took it off the table at the state level. And so we're urging states like Florida to do the same thing and to sort of identify some of these overreaches at the local level. Mm-hmm. is there any will at the federal level, do you think, from your experiences on the Hill and as staff and in the executive, to actually start to do the same kind of thing, which obviously you can't preempt jurisdictions from rent control, but you could say, all right, California, your tax credit allocation is going to be limited as long as you've got rent control, or as long as you've got, I mean, is that just a pathway to endless lawsuits, or is that an avenue?
I think that it is certainly something that when I was also the FHA commissioner towards the end of the last administration, I think that that's something that was greatly frustrating. Ben and I were just talking about this for us, is that when you say throwing, good money after bad, you are pumping more federal dollars into jurisdictions who have the most restrictive land use policies, the worst zoning policies, the biggest lack of affordable housing. It's a lot more expensive to live in places like that. And yet we're subsidizing them to a greater degree. So it's certainly a problem. I mean, I think there should be an appetite to look at everything. Honestly, this is such a crisis. We have to figure out how to increase the supply. It is not happening. And there's, what we're seeing now is there is a backlog from even the great financial crisis where we underbuilt, add COVID to that. Even with the economy slowing down, there is still a tremendous backlog in the supply of affordable homes and homes in general. And I agree with you. Getting more units on the market makes housing more affordable.
Which means having to spend less in subsidies, right? Because if overall market prices go down,
Absolutely.
What you're having to subsidize goes down as well. So Ben, you wanted to?
Yeah, I'm going to chime in with two things. I think was it radical ideas or what was the name of the panel?
Unconventional solution.
Unconventional. So I'll say an unconventional stat that I think some folks overlook, and it speaks to this entire conference. We're actually seeing, when we have the stat, over 50% of people or households are now paying over 30% of their income. That is a housing issue, but also we are increasingly having more and more broken families. So when you have only a single income earner in the family, you're going to have to pay more for your income to go for your housing. So not to throw cold water on everything, but it's an important thing to keep in mind when we look at some of the other policies that are being discussed, I think, here at this conference with FREOPP. But as far as bipartisanship, so I do want to point out, and Dana and I both worked on this in the previous administration, was the president's executive order creating the White House Council on Eliminating Regulatory Barriers to Affordable Housing. The name here. So we worked with 8 federal agencies to do everything we could at the federal level to reduce some of those regulations. We were working with the EPA on a number of their regulations. We worked with the Department of Energy. They did appliance regulations. That goes into the cost of housing and apartments. We worked obviously with the Department of Labor and a number of pieces, at HUD and Treasury. So, and that's growing.
Naming all these agencies is a little depressing. How many agencies are involved in, regulating
housing? So one idea that has worked in Seattle of all places. So there's sort of two things they've done there. One is mandatory inclusionary zoning, which is basically a tax on new development in exchange for a marginal increase in density, FAR, floor area ratio. So you get a little bit more ability to produce a little bit more square footage, but you have to pay per square foot, which is, of course, going to be rationalized by increasing the rent. So what you're doing is you're boosting the rent of the market and then subsidizing the damage that you're doing by doing that with the money that it's a sort of a inflationary laundering machine.
Say on that, though, I think we have to be, and I work in real estate finance, we have to be very sensitive to the fact that rents have gone up a lot. I think 15% on average between last year and this year, even though we're having a lot of other things are happening in the macroeconomy. The issue, though, is that for us, costs have gone up by even more. And so this because you did development. You're trying to get a deal to pencil out. You're looking at the net operating income, which is mainly driven by rent, by the way. You have all of these other costs that you're trying to balance with
including property taxes and utility tax or whatever.
Honestly, like I said, it is amazing that these deals actually get done because we are getting by, kind of by the skin of our teeth a little bit. we are seeing deals kind of get put on hold, die altogether, have a lot of new requirements and a lot of new cost. It is very, very hard. If you were not to price in rent increases, it would be hard to even build these properties in the first place, which is a little bit of a vicious circle. I agree with you.
But what if you did a tax program that in exchange? So in Seattle, as I was mentioning, they have a program that's a tax abatement. It's a 20% inclusionary program, which means if you build 100 units and 20 of them are price restricted to 60 or 50% of AMI, you get a tax break that essentially equals what you're losing in those rents, or it's better. So it's an incentive program to get you to include those units. Could we run the low-income housing tax credit program like that? In other words, piggyback on existing development and do inclusionary with a tax break, whether it's income tax or some other tax credit, to the private developer, rather than using those tax credit for nonprofit housing development.
Right. And I mean, Walker and Dunlop also has a tax credit syndicator. So we're on the front lines with that. We would acknowledge there are a lot of improvements that could be made to the low-income housing tax credit. It is something that has been around since the 1980s. And it probably took 10 years to fully understand it and to get it up and running. So I think we should consider ideas like that. I think they have to be balanced with kind of, the burden of how do you figure this stuff out? How do the markets react to it? But I like the kind of incentive-based nature of what you're describing, which is, already exists a little bit in LIHTC. It's a lot better to have an incentive-based program than something that's a mandate like rent control.
And I think one thing that I would mention when you talk about incentives, and you have to be sure that the program that you're delivering that to goes to or gives the city officials the opportunity to deregulate. You couldn't tie something to like the voucher program, and almost punish people that are receiving vouchers in San Francisco because their city council, won't deregulate. So you got to be careful on what program you're actually pointing or tying those sticks or carrots to.
What about on vouchers? One of the things I've noticed is that the complaint from a lot of local jurisdictions and housing authorities is we've issued X number of vouchers, but a huge percentage of them have gone unused because people can't find a qualifying unit. And these folks are all living somewhere, right? So they're already living in a market rate unit, but they're, as Dana pointed out, paying more than the normative 30% of their gross monthly income. So why not just allow the use of the voucher where the person is living now, and just apply that to their cost burden where they're living, rather than making them go and find it? Would that be desirable, possible? Would it be something that...
Affordable subsidy.
Yeah,
We looked at that.
I mean, the issue there is you have to have a landlord that's willing to accept the voucher. So to say like, okay, here's your voucher to use it in your current apartment or your current house, your landlord has to go through the approval process at HUD. I think.
But if we got rid of that, in other words, I'm a landlord and I got a person that applied for a voucher and now has it, and that person shows up and says, hey, this is some money that's coming from the housing authority to cover part of my rent. And then they get to, that sort of defers what they were paying. In other words, it's a savings to the resident, but the same rent gets paid to the person that's...
I think it's you have to draw the line somewhere on quality control. If the government's going to be paying for a unit, HUD or the taxpayers do have a vested interest to make sure that unit does meet, a bare minimum of quality. And I think you can have that debate on, what is an appropriate amount of inspections and how can we incentivize and encourage more landlords to come into the system. And, the former Secretary Carson had an effort to do that, thinking about different landlord incentives. So I think that's possible, but
I will say though that Section 8, tenant-based Section 8 started out like that,
right.
And then HUD saw that and they said, well, wait a second. We also have a mandate to provide decent, safe, and affordable housing. oh gosh, are we providing these vouchers, to slumlords or to properties that are less than desirable? So gradually, I think government got deeper and deeper into it, really to kind of regulate the whole system.
You're right in the sense that it's a quid pro quo, and you subsidize and you're giving. You have an expectation to get something back. But the problem is that the system's already failing. You've got people that have a voucher and they can't use it,
right,
and they're still paying this high rent. And what I would ask the system to do is, the policymakers have to make this decision because they're the ones empowered to do it. But to say, what's the trade-off? If they're living in a unit and they're paying half their income and they get a voucher, but then that saves them that problem.
Right.
And you don't have to pay the inspectors and all that other stuff, and problem solved, right? They're now, and I understand that the concern and the fear is that, oh my God, there'll be some outcome in which a person is living in a crappy apartment, but they'll still be saving that cost burden above 30%, and that money they can apply to their, to their medical costs or their daycare or whatever. So it's a real compassionate intervention, but it would require us to kind of let go of the outcome potentially being an outlier happening out there.
I think there's so much well-intentioned policy at government agencies like HUD where they want to control outcomes more. I think I've always been more of a fan of block granting, let the states come up with their innovative solutions, let the local jurisdictions do it, just like what you're talking about. But, I think we've gone down that path where even the community development block grant, which is probably one of the most notable block grants in housing, is pretty highly regulated.
Yeah.
It's pretty stringently regulated, even though it is a block grant program and it was intended to just kind of be money that goes to the states and for their own use. So you do run into that. I would love to simplify the system. I think it's badly needed.
John, I wanted to jump in and before to talk about single family housing, because we're kind of talking about multifamily. What do you think are some ideas that might help us address some of the problems with inflation in the single family housing world? And we've had the discussion before about, is it really a good idea to subsidize single family home ownership the way that we have for the last 80 years that we've been doing this?
I think the straight answer is no. It's not exactly a great idea things like mortgage interest deduction, highly regressive item in the tax code. Fortunately, it's now been capped in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But I think it's important to think about this sort of litany of subsidies that other subsidies that exist. So like things like Fannie Freddie, for example, the GSEs in the U.S. They were created in the 1930s in part to help create this thing called the 30-year mortgage, which basically doesn't exist almost anywhere else in the world, or is very rare, but it's totally commonplace in the U.S. The 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And part of that GSE process is basically giving people a lower interest rate other than what they would have if we didn't have GSE involvement. And I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't have GSEs either, but I think it's important to remember that is a real subsidy that's there, just like the mortgage interest tax deduction. I think there's on the single family side of things, I think there's a lot of things that are being called out now, which seem to be more of a distraction from this broader problem. I think the answer is actually we basically need to be able to build more multifamily housing, and there's a lot of single family NIMBY homeowners that won't allow multifamily housing to be built in their respective neighborhoods. And it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem in the Bay Area. It's a huge problem in many coastal cities. Here in Washington, D.C., we can't build anything taller than the Washington Monument, and hence we get this wild outgrowth of just across the Potomac.
Right.
It's the funniest thing. But there's other, I think there are some sort of false enemies maybe that are being painted. For example, the single family rental market, which is particularly big in the Sun Belt. Institutional investors entering, and there's just if you go to some of these progressive committees, committee meetings that are being held by Democrats in the House, they're spending entire committee hearings on this, and I think
on the
on
investor
single family rentals,
right,
institutional investor single family rentals,
right.
like that's the
it's
biggest
like rent
cause.
control. It's another one of those political hot buttons that's local elected officials, and now Sherrod Brown has decided he's declared war on.
I would say build for rent, though, it really enhances the quality of life for a lot of families.
Yes.
I've seen it in action. You are not quite ready to buy a home. And I think a lot of people right now with rates going up are not going to be buying homes. So, build for rent is a very viable option. It provides a neighborhood, stable housing. You get your lawn mowed. You get a lot of services that come with that, almost like you were living, in an apartment in a building with amenities. So I think let's not discount the fact that the markets chose this solution because consumers love it.
Yeah.
Consumers demand it. And, I think that's a good thing.
And I'm going to Cincinnati, where a meeting on Saturday all about, the horrors of institutional investment in rental housing, because the executive director of the port there has also, this is why Sherrod Brown's gotten into this, it has declared war on the institutional investors. And the theory is, well, what we're going to do is we're going to acquire these homes with borrowed money from investors on the bond market. And then we're going to turn them into home ownership opportunities, because rental housing is bad for those neighborhoods. So a very bright woman has sort of taken these hairpin turns in logic. Like, we don't want investors buying housing, so we're going to buy housing with investor capital from the bond market, because rental housing is bad, so we can create home ownership. It's just incoherent. And Sherrod Brown and everybody is just banging this drum about the institutional investor. And it's an example, like rent control, of stuff that just starts getting driven. So,
unintended consequences,
right.
completely the opposite of.
And it's all about politics, at very local level politics, which have these consequences that go up the chain. You both have worked for elected officials, and I think John and I are skeptical of the subsidization of single-family home ownership at the cost that we have. Will we ever see a day when politicians will challenge that entitlement of home ownership, where they'll finally say, not everybody's going to own a home in this country? I mean, are we ever going to get off that cycle of mortgage deductions and backed 30-year mortgages? And is that politically possible? Is it desirable?
Well,
and
let
what's
me
the
just say,
alternative?
I'm sorry to keep taking the microphone.
No, please.
How long have we been talking about this? How long have Fannie and Freddie been in conservatorship? I think one thing I'll say, though, that there's reason for hope, because everyone likes to think of the big, comprehensive plan to solve housing, the silver bullet. I don't know if there is a silver bullet. I think it's a lot of little actions that add up to something. Like, for example, Fannie and Freddie have the credit risk transfer. That is a way to get more of this risk out into the private sector, have the private sector pay for it. That's a very good thing. If you were to increase that, which I think they're going to do over time, ultimately you're offloading that risk exposure from taxpayers. So there are a lot of little solutions when you add them up that can actually do a whole heck of a lot.
Good. Well, I think we're getting close to the end, but the maybe a quick response on this idea of eliminating zoning. I get sometimes Ovik will say, well, now we can't be libertarians here. And I'm not a libertarian. I'm not advocating for the end of health and safety codes in the building code, but what about just getting rid of zoning altogether, and allowing local jurisdictions only to, or encouraging them to regulate primarily for health and safety, but not for form and for use and for location and height and all of that. Is that?
I mean, I think I just call back to where I started this conversation, is just be a little bit more agnostic when it comes to what specific regulations to deregulate. Each community across the country is going to have their various priorities. Some of them it will be more zoning, some of them it might be permitting, some of it might be building codes. And and however they get there to deregulate, I think is fine. And I think that's also the beauty of having all those different communities. So I don't think we should just poke at one specific regulation, albeit zoning.
I have an inner battle. I have an inner battle with myself because I look at why does zoning exist? It's because the power of how your community is run should be with its local citizens. And that's a very good thing, right? We don't want the federal government to come down and say, this is how you should regulate land use. This is how you should zone. I think the problem is just that it's gotten so out of control that things, and I know you've mentioned this in some of the papers that you've written, like, permitting, streamlining permitting, putting in place kind of like stopwatches or clocks to show how long the process has taken, saying this can only take 3 months, barring any exigent circumstance. Like, let's just try to rationalize the process. I don't think we should take away the ability of local citizens to run their communities.
Good. Any burning questions out there that we could get before we run out of time completely? Okay. I think sure.
Well, I was just saying about that, I think you should bring it down to the local level. And I think you have investors and developers locally that have a lot more skin in the game than some of the big institutional investors that are coming in. And I think instead of just changing zoning across the board, like if you're looking at housing as an acute problem right now, right? And then you look at the retail side dying. So community after community seems to have a lot of big, regional malls that are sitting empty. Why don't we just focus on turning a lot of those into and making it easier at that level, at the local level, to convert that to housing?
I think that's happening in some places. I don't know, Dana, if you know of any investment that's happening there.
It's even happened in New York City. It's happening in Washington, D.C. There are challenges. And I think if we went through the laundry list, everyone in this room would be appalled. Some of them are environmental requirements. There could be a gas pipeline nearby or things that it takes, what you have to do to kind of retrofit these buildings, turn them into residential. It just takes time. It's not something you can do overnight, but I think it's a great idea.
Okay, I think we're at time, and thanks everybody for coming. And as always, we're always around for questions or conversation, and just appreciate Dana and Ben and John for being part of this. And let's see if we can hopefully make some of these things happen, or at least try some things that are different, and measure their effect or impact, and put a dent in this thing if we can. So thanks everybody for coming.